Configuring your triggers and bindings. So in the last nugget, we deployed this function app. I'm clicking into it right now. It was called Knox's function. Very clever name, right? If we click into it, you'll see this is going to feel like a normal app service that we run, but the GUI is a little bit different of an experience. It's a lot of the same stuff, but it's still different. You see, we do have slots like deployment slots, but the functions are where we're going to be deploying our function apps. This is kind of a key thing to keep in mind here is we can have multiple functions that interact with each other, all contained within one function app. So let's get started deploying our first function. All we have to do to get that going is simply click the plus right here next to function. And it's going to ask you, what do you want to deploy from this quick start? You can deploy stuff from Visual Studio, VS Code, in the portal, and so on. We'll start off with in the portal, just so we get a look and feel for what's going on with function apps. We're going to deploy stuff from Visual Studio later. I'll click continue. Now, what is the trigger that we're going to be working with here? We've got the webhook and API, where we're going to be creating an API. We got one that is a just run it off a timer. Then we've got some more templates that you can see. This is going to be using things like webhooks with the event grid, so that way we can hook into blob storage or Cosmos DB or other sorts of resources too. I'm going to choose the webhook and API for now because that's a pretty common scenario, and I'll click create. Now, here we have our C# function app, and you'll notice the file itself is called run.csx. This is different from a normal C# extension, right, which is normally just .cs. The CSX is built specifically for function apps. And you can see the function app itself begins with a task called run, where we're passing in a request body. Now, that's because the trigger here was an HTTP request. It's expecting not to run until the request has been posted and received at the URL. At the bottom of the screen here, you can see I can click the little up arrow, and we are brought into a little console where we can see streaming logs as we use the application, which is really, really cool and useful. We also have the ability to copy the logs out or clear the screen, so on. Pretty standard fare. And if we need to actually get the function URL that we can actually hit from the public internet, we just do the get URL, and you can see the authentication here is using a function key. The end of it here ends with this giant long connection string because we haven't configured anonymous access into this function app yet. But for now, we really need to take a look at these triggers and bindings, right? That's what we're here to talk about today because we know that we're using an HTTP request trigger. Let's go into integrate. And this is where we can actually take a look at all of the different types of triggers that we're expecting. For instance, right here, we're expecting an HTTP request trigger passing in something in the body called REQ. And the allowed methods that we have, because we're configuring this from the GUI, is get and post. If you need to add put or delete or any of these other ones, you could feel free to do that. But if we need to change for whatever reason in our code, we don't like REQ to be passed in as the body of the function, we can change this name right here. And we can also change the authorization level right here as well, so anonymous or admin access only. Now, routing we'll talk about when we get into the actual Visual Studio portion of it in just a minute. Inputs, check this out. If we click on the inputs, this is where we're hooking into a bunch of different items. We can use these inputs as something when the post or get request is received, we need to grab an input from one of these sources. Really cool that we can hook into these items. I'll just scroll up a little bit. And the outputs, obviously, with an HTTP request, we're going to be returning an HTTP response, but we can also add an output, and guess what? Similar items here, maybe a little bit extra. We can do an output to SendGrid to send an email, or Twilio to send a text message, even Outlook to send email there. And if these aren't granular enough for you, you can hook into a bunch of other items like other HTTP post requests. So maybe you want to post to a Logic app or something like that. You can totally do that. So you can see inputs and bindings, triggers and bindings are really easy to work with when we're deploying from the portal because they're simply just click on it. That's all you need to do to hook this into your Azure Function app. For instance, check this out. I'll simply click on blob storage, select. It tells us it's going to add this namespace to our particular program. The blob parameter name is going to be output blob. That's what it's going to show up like in the code. And it's going to post this blob to this container and this with a GUID. You'll set the storage account connection right here, and all you have to do at that point is click Save. So it is worth pointing out that if you don't want to use these triggers, inputs, or outputs, you do want to manually code these items in, because you can use any namespace like Entity Framework Core, for instance, to hook into a database. You can come back to the Knox's function right here at the very top and choose Configuration. From here, you've got all of your environment variables and connection strings that you can set in the code, and then simply use Get Environment Variable in your code. No problem. You absolutely have these abilities just like you do in an app service. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.